George Winkler was born on March 26, 1960, in Munich, Germany. During the time of his birth, the German student movement against the increasing authoritarian government was rampant. However, George never saw much light in this issue as he was very young when it was going on. He then spent most of his time split in between New York City and Munich, Germany. His time with himself and his family has provided a lot of insight into how people who fled here have shared their experiences and how they view America's culture. I asked George what the main differences between Germany and America were, and he responded with this.
From my perspective, the German people and Europe generally is not a new country. It's very old society, and they live in a very dense part of the world. There's no great open spaces, and America has developed with the idea that we can grow forever, we can keep moving into open spaces, and that things will always be open, and we can dump garbage into large holes in the ground. And that's catching up with us. And I think the Europeans have an attitude where they realize that they live in a small place and that it's catching up to them. They know how to deal with it, and they deal with it better than we do.
His critiques in culture and education were also very prevalent in this interview.
The people are better educated across the board. Everybody has to speak 2 foreign languages to graduate high school. One of them has to be English, and one of them has to be something else. So you have young people who have a much better sense of the world, who are better informed, and
besides English, French and Spanish were also the most popular languages learned. When asked about how going in between New York and Munich affected him, he responded with this.
Loved it. I love going back. The food is better.
Yeah.
The country's more beautiful. I like it over there.
When asked about how being a dual citizen affected him and his decisions to live in the United States, he responded with this.
If your mom's an American citizen, you're American citizen. But when you're 16, you get to make a choice, because if you're born at that time, if you were born in Germany, you had the right to choose your citizenship when you turn 16, and you have to choose German or American. So you're automatically American, but you could choose to drop your American citizenship and become a German. But if you do that, you have to go back and you have to serve in the military and do all that. So that wasn't practical.
During his time growing up in Germany, George recalls a lot of his earliest memories witnessing the effects of Reconstruction after World War II.
Now, I remember the first memories I have were of around that time, 20 years. And what was different is you see a lot of veterans, a lot of war wounded. All the public transit had the front seats were for what the German word is schwerbehinderte, which means heavily hindered, behindert. So if you have difficulties, and a lot of time you'd see lots of war wounded people, like missing arms, legs, pieces of their face blown out, and lots of war wounded people you saw in the old days.
George's father, who grew up during World War II and eventually fled the country, became the topic of our discussion in how World War II affected his family.
He was a kid during the war, and after the war they became refugees. Leaving their part was overrun by Russians, and they got out of there. And he went to high school and college and around Munich. And at that time he his dad was working for the Americans, and he got recruited to be an American agent.
When asked about what it was like growing up in a traditional German household, he responded more with a critical tone of how Americans have stolen German culture.
The so-called German practices are very much American. The whole American Christmas tradition is completely German. The Santa Claus is German. Saint Nicholas becomes in America Santa Claus, and the red suit and the coming down. If you look back in the history before the First World War, there were more newspapers printed in German language than in English.
He then goes on to make statements about America's roots being German.
And in fact, in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they had to make a choice whether they would speak English, would be the official language, or German.
Back on the topic of his father, we went more into what exactly he went through during the war and how he got out of it, and what life was like post World War II.
When the war ended, he was 12, and they lived in the countryside in a small spa town, so they weren't bombed, but they were. The Russians did roll through on the way to Prague, and then rolled back through on the way out of Prague, and then they were occupied by the Russians. They evacuated to the American zone. My grandfather found work with the Americans at a base, and that was the base where that was the southern. It was actually the intelligence headquarters for the American occupation, and that's how they got interested in recruiting my dad to do work for them. So both he and my grandfather worked for the Americans for a while.
His dad, being a successful textbook producer, has a very interesting story of how he came to obtain his line of work.
Sputnik?
Sputnik.
No.
That was the Russian satellite. They launched the satellite, and the only thing it was a radio transmitter. So everybody in the world could hear this Russian satellite going around the Earth, pinging. So you could turn the radio and you could hear the Russians in outer space. That freaked the Americans out, and they started spending money on all sorts of different things. And one of those things was foreign language education, and my dad was studying for a doctor in economics at the time, and he got an offer basically that he couldn't refuse. You start the textbook company, you start a foreign language division of a textbook company, and you move to New York, and your salary is this. And what that meant was that he could set up his life so that he had to work in Germany half of the part of the year, and so we could go and hang out in Germany for the summers because that he was always over there working.
Finally, I asked George about his experiences being a German immigrant and if it affected his life in getting a job and finding work.
No, it helped. It helped because I had background in. I had conversational German and I studied French, and I was familiar with things. So it's sort of directly led to my career in the wine business because I was the guy who could read the labels. I was the guy who understood the language on the labels, and wine was a big mystery, and I could figure it out a little bit, and that's how I started. I mean, quite literally, I became a German wine guy because I was able to read the wine labels. That's exactly how it started.
George Winkler and his father are some of the most interesting and unique people I've ever met. Their stories about experiencing different cultures firsthand has seemed to come in handy and benefited their family in many ways. Overall, they used their experiences to gain an edge in work and livelihood in the United States and have become a great example of all the benefits other cultures have to offer.